Welcome to the BizFlow M Overview video. This video will give you an outline of BizFlow M, a platform designed to help non-technical users to design, configure, and deploy modern user experiences integrated with process-driven workflows. So what exactly is BizFlow M? BizFlow M is the combination of our App Dev Designer application with our BizFlow workflow engine and was designed with the goal to help automate the flow of work within your organization. This platform promotes a hybrid development collaboration between citizen developers and heavy coders to provide rich UI/UX-driven applications. The framework itself is based off of open source technologies such as Bootstrap, Prime React, JSON, REST, and HTML, and also developer-familiar components from libraries such as jQuery. The platform also supports responsive design, integrations, UI styling, reporting, and reuse of UI components and data entities. BizFlow M also fully supports and works with BizFlow BPM and has a learning curve that takes a fraction of the time compared to conventional coding. It is also legacy solution friendly and can work with existing applications through integrations. Today, we'll touch on three component applications of the BizFlow M platform, which are App Dev Studio, Universal Data Modeler, and BizFlow Process Studio. We'll first begin with App Dev, our low-code, no-code designer platform. The first thing to do in App Dev is to define a workspace and then create projects to be built in that newly created space. To do so, simply mouse over to the Project Manager, press the blue button on the bottom labeled Create New Workspace, set a name and description for the workspace, and then click Save. After creating the workspace, you'll then need to go create a project by pressing the blue button labeled New Project on the right-hand side, and define a project name, a brief description of the project, and then clicking Save to create the project. You'll now have a project under the root of that workspace that you just created. After creating workspace and projects, you must delegate access to the workspace and project respectively. You do this by pressing the Authority tab and press Modify and search for users and add them as needed. You can define the restrictions of access by pressing the R, M, A circles, which stands for the three levels of access of read-only, modification, or administration. Please note that giving access to either workspace or project alone does not grant full access in parallel. Make sure the user is granted access to both the workspace and project. The next step is to define the data entities that will be used in your workspace and projects. Click on the Data Modeler button located on the top left to navigate to the Data Modeler. Before diving into the Data Modeler, let's drill down into a new feature called the Entity Bank. The Entity Bank is a global entity library that can be used across multiple applications. This can be useful for things such as a commonly used data group, such as an employee data group, which has data entities tied to the employee name, employee email, ID number, departments, positions, and etc. The Entity Bank access is divided into three user roles, which are designers, publishers, and administrators. Users must be selectively assigned and granted access to the Entity Bank. Here, you can search up users on the left-hand side and drag and drop the user in the respective user groups with the ability to remove and modify them as needed. One thing to note is that the initial admin is the first person to access this Entity Bank. That user will have to add on users initially and delegate more admin authority access as more admins are needed. The next tab over is the Design menu, where you can add global data entities. To begin, click the blue button on the top right labeled Add Entity. You'll need to create a name for the entity, enter a description, select the data entity type from the dropdown, and then providing the corresponding parameters for the selected data type. You can create your own custom lookup tables for the dropdown component by going to the furthest right-hand tab labeled Lookup Manager. To create a lookup, select the local level to create the lookup and press the blue plus icon on the top left. Then assign a name and provide a description of the lookup and press the Add button located on the bottom to finish. Navigate to the newly created lookup and press the blue button labeled Add Values on the top right to start adding lookup values. Assign a name, lookup value, and a display order value, which starts from the index 0 and onwards, and press Add on the bottom when finished. You can modify the values in the display order at any time by pressing the blue Edit button. With a lookup created within the Entity Bank, you can now create a lookup entity that connects with that specific list. This will come in handy for commonly used lookups within an organization, such as employee names or their ID numbers. In order for the entities to be fully added into the entity bank, they must first be committed by the designer with a brief comment of why the entity is being added into the bank. This is because once the entities are added into the bank, they can no longer be deleted, but can still be modified. Once committed, the entities will be in the Review tab, in which the publishers can drag over the entities to the Checkout panel and either reject them with a comment or validate them to be finally published. Once published, the entities will be stored in the Category tab and will be available to use when creating data group sets through your Universal Data Modeler. Now, drilling down on the actual data modeler, you must first check out the project by pressing the lockbox icon on the top right-hand corner. You can then create a data group by clicking the Group tab on the left and then pressing the plus icon and providing a name for the set of data entities. You will then click and drag the group over to the root folder, which will auto-generate the group folder in the design space. The next step is creating data entities. There are two methods when creating your entities. Either one, clicking the E to access the entity bank to pick and choose into your cart to check out into your entity pool, which will automatically pull them from the bank after hitting apply, or two, creating a new local entity by pressing the plus sign. The steps are the same as you would do so when creating entities in the entity bank. Note that this method of creating entities do not require a validation process. Unlike those created through the bank, these entities are tailored specifically and stored locally for a certain application or project. After having all of your data entities made, you can simply click and drag them over into the group subfolder in the design space. Note that once the data entity is being used within a group, the left-hand color indicator switches from orange to green to show a visual status of being used. Once the data entities have been allocated to a group, you can now add components to each individual entity by pressing the letter C button and assigning them individually. In here, you can see a preview and assign the many options and components that belong to those data entity types and define certain attributes of the entity as well. Once you have selected your component and applied your attributes, click Apply to save your changes. With all the entities made and the components assigned, you will want to save and publish your data model. Press the Save icon on the top right-hand side, then the Cloud icon to upload and publish your data model, and then the Lockbox icon to check back in the project for other users. Now switching back to App Dev, we are now ready to design the front-end portion of the project. Before we get started, let's get a quick overview of the BizFlow Studio layout. The App Dev Studio layout is structured into 5 designated areas. This includes a top menu area with the menu and set of toolbars, a left panel area with panel content, a studio canvas in the center, a right panel area with panel content, and a bottom panel area which expands into a chat collaboration box. First, press the Project Manager and select the project. Then press the blue button labeled New Form and define a name and provide a brief description and press Save. Do the same for the blocks as well. A form is typically defined as your application, meanwhile the blocks are viewed as the building blocks that make up a form with reusability of the blocks in mind for multiple forms such as global headers, menus, and footers. After creating the forms and blocks, open them up through the left panel area so that they are laid out in the canvas. With a block opened up, we can now design the layout of our application. From the Component tab, we can click and drag over layout components such as field sets onto the canvas and configure the label we want on the right-hand content area. Here, we change the title to Employee Information and also set the toggleable feature as false to make the label static, and then click the blue button labeled Apply to make the changes. We can then drag on additional layouts such as grids to define regions of where we will want to place our data entities and customize the rows and columns in a right panel content. After we define the spaces, we can click on the project schema on the left panel area, navigate to our entity group, and click and drag over the data entities onto the canvas in their respective cell within the grid. Here, we are also adding a label component to write out some information someone might see while using this application or form. Once again, simply click and drag the label over onto the canvas and make changes to the content on the right-hand side and click Apply when done. With the components laid out and the layout finalized, we can shift our focus onto styling, which is done through the cascading style sheets, or CSS for short. AppDev allows for two methods when it comes to styling, which is either 1, through traditional HTML style tags where applicable, or 2, writing out the CSS style properties and values in the spaces below respectively. Traditional and seasoned developers can also write their own custom styling classes in the Extend CSS script from the Toolbox menu bar. The custom class, once created, simply needs to be entered in the component class value field located in the right panel content. We can further change the layout styling of the data entities by selecting the Attribute tab on the right panel and then pressing the various layout presets. To apply the same layout to all the data entities, simply change one data entity initially and then press the blue button labeled Recent Layout and Style for all other entities. After you have configured the layout and styling, you can click on one of the three Preview Mode buttons at the top right to see a responsive design of the block. You can choose either Windows, tablet, or mobile and interact with the components on the screen. This allows you to see the overall design, which helps you configure your design and application in real time. After you completed building out the necessary blocks, the next step is to build up a form by adding the corresponding blocks. Open up a form, go down into the Component tab on the left-hand side and into the Handlers section. Click and drag over an Embed Block Panel component and select the block from the dropdown. Note that importing a block from the left menu tab directly achieves a similar result. Embedded blocks are the preferred method as they automatically apply changes from the original block in real time and are much easier to maintain on a form. This practice saves a lot of time in terms of rework and modification. After creating your form with the corresponding blocks, you may now publish your project. Click on the Cloud Upload icon on the top right and press the blue button labeled Validation and Publish to check for logic error. Once validated, add a tag and a brief description regarding the publication such as version notes or a log history and then press Publish to finish. As you can see on the screen, this example shows a more detailed performance evaluation form and showcases the art of possibility. You can add things such as rating selection dropdowns with total calculations logic, or even scoring and comment sections designated for different user groups such as HR and managers. Now transitioning into our BizFlow portal, we need to define users and user groups that will interact with the application. To do so, simply navigate over to the BizFlow menu bar on the top left and click on the Administration tab. From here, drill down to Authentication under General Administration and check out the unit group, and then click the plus icon on the top right and add a user with their name, a login ID, a password, their email address, and then switch over to the License tab and assign the designated licenses for that specific user. After you press Add, check back in the unit group to successfully add the user and verify that the user is created in the list. Now it's time to assign the user to a user group. Go back to the administration page and click User Groups under Business Administration. Select and check out a hierarchy, or first create a hierarchy if not yet made, and then press the plus icon to add a user group. Assign a name to a group, search for the corresponding users, assign the appropriate authority groups in the Administration Control tab, and click OK to exit, and then check back in the hierarchy to save. The users and user groups defined, it is now time to transition into our BizFlow Process Studio, or BPS for short. This is where we will connect the front end with the workflow. To create a new project in BizFlow Process Studio, right-click the server and select New Project. Define a project name and description for the project, and then press Finish. Drill down in the newly created project space, right-click on Application and select New Application. Assign a name and description, and then select the application type as BizFlow AppDev and click Next. We will now need a unique BizFlow embedded URL called a Work Item Handler, or WIH for short. Switch back to AppDev and click the letter H history icon on the top right. Select the publication and press Copy URL for WIH button to generate the URL of the AppDev application. Now go back to BizFlow Process Studio and paste that newly generated URL and click Next, and then click Finish. Now it's time to define a process definition that will use that application we just created. With the application made, now it's time to define a process definition. Right-click Process Definitions and select New Process Definition. Right-click on the gray paint area and select Application. Drill down to the Project and Application folder to the application and click the arrow to move it to the list, and then press OK. With the application added to the process definition, you can now modify your swim lanes as needed. You can add or delete swim lanes by right-clicking the diagram, adjusting the size of the diagram with the grab handles, or define the labels by double-clicking the names. After making those modifications, you can define your process by clicking and dragging over flowchart shapes from the palette. Here we define the start action, activities for both initiator and reviewers, and an end action. Connect the shapes by mousing over them and dragging over arrows to their corresponding shapes to design your desired process flow. You can also name your activities and flows as needed. Here, we change the activity 1 as Initiate Evaluation and activity 2 as Review Evaluation. We also define the sequence flow going from the reviewer to the initiator as a reject response. Once you are done laying out your process definition, press File, then Add to Server, drill down into your project space, provide a name and description, and set the status. Then click OK when finished. One thing to note are the green question mark icons, which states that there is something missing for the activity. In this case, the users were not defined for each activity. To add a user group in the activities, right-click the activity and go to the Participant tab, and select the Type, Hierarchy, and find the user group, and then click the right arrow button to add the user group in the participant list. Here is a more detailed process flow, where it starts with an initiator followed by 2 reviewer sequences in parallel connected to an AND gateway. This gateway requires both activities in the reviewer swim lane to be completed in order to end the process. With all the process definitions now in line, we must now add the application to each individual activity. Right-click each activity and press Application, select the application in the application list, and click the right arrow to move it over. Now it's time to publish the process definitions and application. Right-click on the project and select Publish. Select the process definitions and applications in the project object list. Press the right arrow to move them to the Objects to Publish list, and then do the same in the second step for both process definitions and application tabs. Referencing back to AppDev, you can now show and hide certain blocks within a form based on activity names you assigned in BPS. As you see here in the Condition tab for the reviewer blocks, we have set a display none function that states that if the activity name does not equal the activity name defined in BPS, it will not show for anyone that does not belong to that particular activity. To see your published process, go back to the BizFlow portal and click on the menu and select Start New. Here, you will see all your published processes and can either view each process and see a visual diagram of the process, or click Start to initiate the process. As you can see, the process has integrated with the AppDev form. You can interact with the form, check to see that the correct content is being displayed, and test the process flow. In this screen, we are checking to see that the input fields are responding, the lookup values are being displayed properly, and that the score value calculation logic is working as intended. Here, after we submit it as initiator, the process triggered the manager review activity, where a manager will come in and review the initial inputs of the performance evaluation and write comments and continue on with the process. Seeing how the manager review box is showing, it is an indication that the process and application are working as intended. This concludes the overview of BizFlow M. The platform was built on the idea to enable non-technical users to design, configure, and deploy modern user experiences integrated with process-driven workflow. BizFlow M combines strategy, innovation, solution design, and development to streamline, automate, and transform business operations.